My name is Amber Roberts, and this is my final presentation for English grammar, and my chosen topic is writing with dialogue. In this presentation, I hope that you will learn proper grammar rules in written dialogue and monologue. The first thing I want to cover are the basics of quotations. When writing a quote, you must box the quote with quotations that mark the beginning and end of the quote. If the dialogue is a thought, then there would be no quotations, and instead the quote will be written in italics. Finally, when writing a quote within a quote, the subquote will be marked with apostrophes. The sentence in quotes will always be treated as its own sentence, even if there is text outside of the quotations that would technically make the sentence incomplete. In this example, you will see that it says Clara said, comma, and then the quote. Notice how the first word in that quote leads with a capital letter. If you do not feel comfortable putting phrases such as Clara said at the beginning of sentences, it is also grammatically correct to end with that phrase instead. In these examples, you can see how both sentences for John inquired can either lead with or end with that phrase. Finally, if the quote's sentence ends in a period, break it with a comma instead of ending the sentence off, if the sentence continues with a phrase such as Alex informed. If you are not following up the quote with anything like that, then it's okay to just end the sentence with a period. And note that if you end with a question mark or an exclamation point, you will never end the quotation with a comma. It will stay in its proper punctuation. In writing, you can break quotation marks and interrupt it with a note from the narrator, if it is needed for clarification or setting the scene. The first example here shows that it can be used to clarify who is talking in the scene, and the second example shows as something that you can set up the scene for the reader. These can be used to amplify paragraphs where speakers jump into the conversation suddenly or to add realism into a conversation. As I mentioned earlier, if a quotation needs an exclamation point or a question mark, then you must always end with one, even if you are still following up the sentence with a phrase such as John said. However, if the statement outside of the quotation needs the punctuation, then you must place the question mark or exclamation mark outside of the quotations. Note that this rule only applies for question marks and exclamation points. Commas and periods will always remain inside the quotations, while dashes or colons will always remain outside of them. How do you know when to write internal dialogue in italics and when to narrate in normal text? This can be especially tricky if the narrator is talking in first person. The easiest way to tell the difference is that internal dialogue will be direct words from the speaker's thoughts. Most people don't go around narrating their life. Rather, they are more likely to observe and then say direct phrases such as, "What an absolutely terrible day." Narration is anything else that is not within the person's direct thoughts. Further, internal monologue has the same grammar rules as external dialogue, with the only difference being that it's in italics. If there is a quote within the internal monologue, there are still no quotes. Instead, the italics return to normal font for a temporary amount of time. In an attempt to make the text less confusing to the reader, a writer might accidentally find themselves writing the dialogue as too contextual, which could make it annoying to read. See this first paragraph. Notice how many times it repeats Stephen is the one talking? It's pretty obvious, isn't it? You would get it the first time. Instead, follow something more akin to the second paragraph. Notice how Stephen is only mentioned as talking once to establish to the reader that he is the one talking. Instead of mentioning that he's talking again, I instead change that part of the narration to describe something he's doing and something he's feeling, to add characterization and allow the reader to set the scene in their minds as they read. It adds more flavor to text rather than repeating the same information over and over again. When is it okay to break the rules in grammar when writing dialogue? Well, whenever you want. If you're writing a modern-day story about high schoolers, for example, wouldn't it make more sense for them to speak with contractions? Not many high schoolers are running around saying things like, "I do not want to go to school today. You are not going to make me do something I cannot do." Sounds kind of robotic, right? Unless a robot is what you're looking for, don't be afraid to break the rules of grammar to add personality for your characters. Here are some miscellaneous rules to wrap up the presentation. When a single character is having a monologue, don't end the paragraph with quotation marks if they start speaking immediately at the beginning of the next one. However, do start the next paragraph with quotations. It's a little confusing, I know, but that's how it works. And I provided an example that I wrote up in case you were still confused. Dialogue should always be broken between paragraphs for each speaker. If John dialogues in the first paragraph, Alex shouldn't also talk in the same paragraph. End John's and start a new one for Alex. Finally, play with chemistry between characters and with descriptions in between dialogue so it isn't boring for the reader. And most of all, have fun writing. Our reader can always pick up on the passion of the writer. If you aren't having fun or if you're not loving your work, the reader will pick up on that. There are a million rules to dialogue and grammar, as there are any branches of English grammar. To avoid this presentation being 30 minutes long, I included some more sources if you were interested in wanting to learn more. And of course, reading books is always the best practice in learning grammar rules. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed and I hope you learned, and have an amazing summer.